We're going to be in Ecclesiastes 10, beginning in verse 16. You can turn there, and as you do, I want to review kind of where we have been in the book of Ecclesiastes so far. At Northtown Trinity, we practice what's called expository preaching, verse by verse through books of the Bible. And expository simply refers to the fact that in our preaching, we desire to expose the meaning of the text. We preach verse by verse through whole books of the Bible because we believe that not only are the books that God has provided in his book valuable, but even the verses themselves. And as we go through an entire book, those verses end up giving us a picture of what God is trying to say to us. We believe that it's beneficial for our knowledge, for our worship, and for our love of God. So zooming out for a few minutes here before we begin, is going to tell us where we've been and tell us what God still wants us to hear from the teacher of Ecclesiastes. I want you to consider with me that the book of Ecclesiastes has unfolded like many brief scenes from a movie, kind of a video diary of the teacher. The teacher's walked the paths of his kingdom, seeing farmers tend their crops, seeing shepherds watch over their flocks. In another scene, he's wandering through forests, learning from the trees and the plants. Then he's walking through cities. He's walking through cities and marketplaces. He's seeing the young and the old, the rich and the poor, the wise and the fool, all going about their lives. He's sat in courtrooms and places of worship and other institutions. And he's witnessed the good, the bad, and the ugly. He's been a guest at weddings and experienced the joy of blossoming love. He's visited newborn babies and their mothers and beheld the wonder of new life. And he's also attended funerals, and he's learned of grief and despair. Through all these scenes, he's been troubled. He's been wavering between celebration and devastation, hope and hopelessness. Our sermon series has been titled, "What's the Point?" And by this point, the teacher has felt that deeply. Over the last few weeks, though, the scene has changed. Now we're in the living room with the teacher. We're sitting there. He's shown us this movie of all of these clips, and he's given his commentary. He has this far-off look in his eyes as he remembers with us the joy and the sadness. But now he's back with us. And instead of more observations, he's giving us words of wisdom now through the rest of the book. You see, in all that he has experienced, in all that he has seen, he sees that the path of wisdom remains. Foolishness, he says, remains too. But the teacher is urging us to walk the path of wisdom. That in a world of vanity, this is the path, the only path that's worth going. This week, the teacher shares with us another series of Proverbs. Proverbs is just another word for wisdom sayings. They contain in them powerful truths like really small parables like Jesus told. Through these Proverbs, the teacher is preparing us for something. In a world of uncertainty, wisdom keeps living faithfully and trusting God with the outcomes. If you haven't already, go with me to Ecclesiastes chapter 10, beginning in verse 16. And we're going to see very quickly here that the teacher says that folly destroys, but wisdom sustains. Folly destroys, but wisdom sustains. Join me in verse 16. He says, "Woe to you, O land, when your king is a child, and your princes feast in the morning. Happy are you, O land, when your king is the son of nobility, and your princes feast at the proper time for strength and not for drunkenness. Through sloth, the roof sinks in, and through indolence, the house leaks. Bread is made for laughter, and wine gladdens life, and money answers everything. Even in your thoughts, do not curse the king, nor in your bedroom curse the rich, for a bird of the air will carry your voice, or some winged creature tell the matter." What the teacher is describing here isn't a dramatic collapse. There's no invading army, no single catastrophic event, no moment you could point to and say, this is where it all went wrong. What he's describing in this kingdom, he's describing something slower and in some ways more discouraging. He's describing a society that's quietly decaying because the people at the top are not doing the hard work their position demands. The king, he says, acts like a child acting impulsive, self-absorbed, more interested in his own comfort than in the weight of his responsibilities. And his leaders, the teacher said, aren't much better. They're at the table, feasting at breakfast, not to gather energy for a long day's work, but just because they can. The roof of the house leaks, and nobody fixes it. Not because no one sees what's going on, but because those who are responsible for addressing it can't be bothered. And underneath all of this, the culture itself has begun to absorb the cynicism that bad leadership produces. Verse 19 captures it with this almost darkly comic kind of statement. Bread is for laughter, wine is for enjoyment, and money answers everything. Friends, that's not wisdom's conclusion. That is what a people concludes when it has watched its leaders long enough to stop expecting better. By verse 20, though, verse 20, there's this full portrait of where this kind of discouragement ends. The people are not out in the public square arguing for something better. They're not working, not building, not trying to sustain what is good despite the rot on top. No, where are they at? Alone, in a bedroom, cursing under their breath. There's private bitterness. There's a quiet contempt. The person in that verse has decided somewhere along the way that engagement is for fools and withdrawal is the only honest response to a world that keeps on disappointing. Now, I want to name what that is because I think the teacher finds it really important. That sense, that weight, that's called cynicism. Cynicism. Cynicism has a way of telling you, of making you feel like that's the most intellectually honest position available. When you've watched enough leadership fail, when you've seen enough institutions crumble or corrupt, when you've cared enough times and been disappointed enough times, cynicism presents itself not as a spiritual problem, but as a reasonable conclusion. Cynicism says, I used to care about this, but I've learned better. Now I'm not naive. I remember the first time that I voted. I was 17. And because I was going to be 18 before the general election, I got to vote in the primaries. I barely knew the candidates. I'm voting for county who knows what and state Lord knows, and issues that my 17-year-old brain couldn't imagine. But I did have a sense that it mattered. I had this sense that if the right people went to the right offices, that we could actually change something worth changing. And then I got older and I noticed in news cycle after news cycle, I started to see that there was a gap between what leaders said and what leaders did. And over time, I finally caught myself. I had stopped caring. Not in a principled, examined way. I had just quietly disengaged. When someone would bring up politics or the news or civic life, I had a whole script ready. Ironic, detached, maybe a little bit superior, if I'm honest. Like I had just simply seen through the whole thing. Now, what I didn't recognize at first was what felt to me in that moment like wisdom was actually something else. It was bitterness with a better vocabulary. And that's what the teacher is talking about here. He understands that impulse. He's seen broken leadership. He's not naive. But notice what he never does. He never tells his readers that because leaders are foolish, the wise response is to just become small or disengaged or cynical. The entire comparison that he's drawing between the childish king and the king of genuine nobility, between the leaders feasting at dawn and leaders feasting at the proper time for strength, the entire contrast assumes that wisdom is still possible and that it's worth pursuing, even in a world where folly is common. Wisdom doesn't pretend the roof isn't leaking. Wisdom picks up the tools. Wisdom shows up. Wisdom refuses to let the foolishness of others be an excuse for its own foolishness. And this matters, okay? This matters because cynicism isn't neutral. It doesn't just leave you in a static state of disengagement. Cynicism is actively forming you. Every time you reach for the detached posture, every time you let contempt for broken institutions be the last word in your heart, something hardens. Something hardens. It becomes harder to soften. Cynicism hollows out our capacity for faithful action as followers of Jesus. It hollows out our ability to act because faithful action requires the belief that what we do still matters. And cynicism's whole goal is to convince you that nothing does. So the teacher's question, right at the end of this section here, the teacher's question is a heart question, not just a practical one. The question isn't simply, are you fixing the roof? The question is this: what has watching broken leadership done to your inner life? It has an effect on us. Has it made you more resolved to pursue what is wise and good and faithful? Or has it made you smaller, quieter, maybe more bitter and less engaged with what God is actually calling you to do? Because, friends, wisdom sustains. That's the truth. One of the truths of Ecclesiastes is that wisdom sustains. Wisdom keeps building, it keeps showing up, and it keeps pursuing what is good. Cynicism just consumes itself. But here's where the teacher's realism takes us next. He calls it like he sees it. But here's where we go next, because sustaining that kind of faithful engagement, resisting cynicism is really difficult, isn't it, when you can't see what the future holds. Go with me to chapter 11, verse 1. And here we're going to see the teacher say that wisdom acts even when the future is uncertain. He says, "Cast your bread upon the waters, for you will find it after many days. Give a portion to 7 or even to 8, for you know not what disaster may happen on the earth. If the clouds are full of rain, they empty themselves on the earth. And if a tree falls to the south or to the north, in the place where the tree falls, there it will lie. He who observes the wind will not sow, and he who regards the clouds will not reap." Now, before I talk about what this passage means, I want to be honest about something. Verse 1 of chapter 11 of Ecclesiastes is one of the most debated verses in all of the book, okay? I did a lot of studying, and I couldn't nail it down for you. So I'll tell you all of the things that the scholars have said. Some scholars believe that that this idea of casting your bread upon the waters is an analogy for maritime trade, where merchants would put their goods onto a ship and would set them out to be delivered and would wait days, months, years for a profit to be brought back. Others see it as an agricultural metaphor, the idea that you would spread seed along the edges where the floodwaters were still at, trusting that when the floodwaters receded that a crop would grow. And others, even going back as early as the church fathers, said that this was actually talking about generosity. It was a call to cast your bread freely, even when it feels like maybe it's just a waste, and trust that the giving that we do is never truly lost. Now, here's the thing. I think we can debate what that verse is exactly talking about, and it probably matters less than we think, because the writer of Ecclesiastes goes on to actually give us a pretty strong hint of what the whole point of it is. When he says there, give a portion to 7 or even to 8 because you do not know what disaster is coming. That is ancient wisdom for diversifying your risk, right? You don't just buy one stock, you buy 7 or 8, he says. There you go. It's financial advice for you today. But he's saying there is that we don't know what's going to happen. Not in this life, we don't. We shouldn't place every hope, he's saying, in a single outcome when the future is fundamentally unknowable. Clouds fill with rain and pour it out. A tree falls. For no reason at all, a tree falls, and that's where it's at. His point here is that some things are simply out of our hands. Verse 4, the hinge of this whole section, says, whoever watches the wind won't sow, and whoever looks at the clouds won't reap. The person waiting for perfect conditions will wait forever. The field never gets planted. The harvest never comes. What the teacher here is confronting is a disposition of our heart that is so common, it's so reasonable sounding, that most of us carry it without even recognizing it for what it is. Because here's the thing, it sounds like wisdom. It sounds like prudence, and it sounds like this. I just need a little more clarity before I move. Just a little bit more clarity. I want to make sure that this is the right direction. I don't want to act. I don't want to do anything unless I know how it's going to work out. Hear me. There's nothing wrong with careful discernment. The teacher here is not telling us to act rashly, which is why he tells us to invest in 7 or 8, not just 1. But careful discernment is different from refusing to ask until risk has been eliminated. Because here's the truth in this world. Risk is never eliminated, is it? That's just not how life under the sun works. I thought back this week to a moment some time ago when I was standing on the edge of a really important conversation at work. I knew I needed to have it. I'd kind of been circling and avoiding it for a while. I had really good reasons in my mind for holding off. And so I watched the wind. I watched the clouds. I kept finding new variables to keep on calculating until I realized that calculating had been its own way of avoiding. The conversation I had been waiting to be ready for was actually waiting on me. And that's what verse 4 is describing. The person watching the wind isn't lazy. I don't want to be clear on that. The person watching the wind isn't lazy. They may be working very hard. You may be reading, researching, praying, analyzing, preparing. The problem isn't an absence of effort. The problem is that all of that effort is a way of avoiding the step altogether. There's always more wind to watch. That's the truth of it. There's always more wind to watch. There's always another thing to consider. And the teacher, with this kind of gentle push to us from behind, he points out that this kind of waiting is not the same thing as wisdom. It's actually its own brand of foolishness. It's a form of paralysis, kind of dressed in a language of preparation. Remember, the correction that the teacher offers here isn't recklessness. And don't hear me saying that you should go out and YOLO. The teacher doesn't say that the risks aren't real. He's explicitly assuming that they are. He says, give a portion to 7 or 8 and not just to 1. He isn't asking you to pretend that the outcome is guaranteed. He's asking you to recognize that certainty is not a prerequisite for obedience. Let me say that again. Certainty is not a prerequisite to obedience. Faithfulness is measured by sowing, not controlling the harvest. Listen, the harvest has never been yours to begin with. You have not been given the authority to control the harvest, to control the outcome. What you have been given is the seed and the morning and the field before you. That's what wisdom works with. I know some of us are waiting for God to remove uncertainty before we'll step into obedience. And I want to say this real carefully, but very plainly. That's rarely how God works. He doesn't hand you a map and say, if you go this way, this is how it's going to turn out. He calls you to cast the bread, and he handles where it lands. He calls you to sow in the morning and in the evening, not knowing which will prosper, and he handles the harvest. The question is not whether the outcome is guaranteed. The question is whether you will do what faithfulness requires today with the seeds that you have been given, trusting the one who governs the outcomes. I want you to consider this for a moment. And maybe for you, this is a takeaway tonight. What obedience is God calling you to today? What does faithfulness require of you right now? That takes us to really the deepest question of all, a question that's not really about action at all, but instead, it's a question about trust. Go with me to verse 5. And here we're going to see that the teacher points out that uncertainty reminds us to trust God. He says, as you do not know the way the Spirit comes to the bones in the womb of a woman with child, so you do not know the work of God who makes everything. In the morning, sow your seed, and at evening withhold not your hand, for you do not know which will prosper, this or that, or whether both alike will be good. The teacher has pressed us past cynicism, past fearful hesitation, and now he's arriving what's really underneath both of those all along. Underneath cynicism, there is disappointment, isn't there? A world that hasn't cooperated with our expectations. Underneath fearful hesitation, there's risk aversion, a future that won't cooperate with our need for certainty. But underneath both of those is something that the teacher here names with real clarity, and it's simply this, we do not know what God is doing. And if we're honest, that not knowing is not primarily about intellect. It's a problem of the heart because we want to know. We want to be the ones that understand the whole of a thing. We want to see how it all fits together. We want to be those who aren't left in a position of trusting someone else for the outcome. The image that the teacher chooses to illustrate this with is one that's profoundly intimate. It's a child being formed in the womb. Now, science tells us much about how that body comes to be and how it forms in the womb. But you do not know how the Spirit comes to those bones. I don't know. Nobody knows. You don't know how something that begins as almost nothing becomes bones and flesh and breath and personality and a person who is one day going to sit in a room like this with their own questions and problems and insecurities. That mystery is happening right now. It's been happening for all of human history, and we have not been able to get to the bottom of it. In the same way, friends, you do not know all of the work that God is doing. That sentence is humbling. It's humbling. But if we're willing to accept it, it's also freeing. You do not know the work of God who makes everything. And his not telling you is not his negligence. It's a posture of a father who knows that his children don't need a map. They need him. That's the movement that the teacher is inviting us into in verse 6. In the morning, sow your seed. And at the evening, withhold not your hand, for you do not know which will prosper, this or that, or both of them alike. Morning and evening, friends. The full span of your energy. The full span of your day. The beginning of your energy, the end of your energy. Sow faithfully throughout. And don't withhold your hand just because you don't know or can't control the outcome. The reason that you can keep sowing, the only reason is that the outcome belongs to God. He's not asking you to be indifferent to the results. He wants to hear the desires of our hearts and prayers to him about how we hope things, desire for things, long for things to turn out. He's not asking you to be indifferent, but he's asking you to release your death grip on the results because you were never meant to carry that weight. This is where the heart issue that this path has been kind of circling around, and it gets named here directly. It's not cynicism. It's not fear. At its center is the idol of certainty. The belief that if I could just understand enough, if I could just see clearly how all of this is going to unfold, then I could finally rest. Then I could finally trust. Then I could finally give up control. But the teacher says, that's backwards. That's backwards. You don't receive understanding first and then trust. You trust first. You trust first, and in that trust, you find the rest that understanding alone could never provide. Peace doesn't come from knowing everything God is doing. Peace comes from trusting the God who is doing it. The one who makes everything, including whatever it is that may be in your life today that you can't make sense of. The teacher here has given us something genuinely good, a realistic, practical, deeply pastoral picture of what wisdom looks like when you can't see around the bend. Friends, resist the corrosion of cynicism. Act faithfully without waiting for certainty to arrive. Trust the God who governs everything that you can't govern. Those are not small things. I want to press a little further here, because by the end of this passage, the teacher hasn't yet resolved the tension that he's been building. He's actually deepened it. He told us earlier in the book, if you remember, that wisdom is rare, that the righteous man and the foolish man both seem to just perish in the end. And now he's telling us that the faithful life requires sowing without telling us, or without knowing which will prosper. He's not giving us a self-improvement program. He's describing a life of trust and dependence. Centuries after Ecclesiastes was written, Jesus sat down on a hillside to teach. And he told a story about a farmer who went out to sow his seed. And what strikes you if you read that passage carefully is just how unguarded his sowing is. How unguarded. He throws seed everywhere. He throws it on the path. He throws it on the rocks. He throws it on the thorns. He throws it finally in the good soil as well. He does it without calculation, without hoarding the seed back for where he is sure it's going to grow the best. As a kid who grew up on a farm and who went to school in a cornfield, this looks like poor farming to me. A careful farmer minimizes waste. A careful farmer studies his field first. But Jesus tells the story to describe something deeper than farming. He tells it to describe the way the kingdom of God actually works through a generosity that looks like recklessness to those who haven't understood who the farmer is and whose the harvest is. Jesus himself was that sower. Jesus came into the world and he preached and he healed and he loved and he called, and so much of it just seemed to fall flat on rocky ground. He sowed truth into hearts that rejected it, grace into lives that walked away from it, mercy into situations that returned it to him as hostility. And then when he came to the cross, that seed finally hit the ground. From the vantage point of Friday afternoon, everything that Jesus had sown looked like total and final loss. There was no visible harvest. There was a sealed tomb and a bunch of scattered and scared disciples who had already concluded that their hope was buried. But the teacher in Ecclesiastes says that you don't know the work of God who makes everything. And it turns out that even the cross, especially the cross, was not outside that work. The only true wise man who ever lived, who never let cynicism harden his heart, who never waited for uncertainty to fade before he obeyed the Father, who never grasped for control but entrusted himself completely to the one who makes everything. That man died so that people like us could be forgiven for every time we have done the opposite. Jesus bore the full weight of our cynicism, our fearfulness, and our white-knuckled need to hold on to control. And in his resurrection, God produced the harvest that 3 days before had looked like total loss. That is the foundation for everything the teacher has been calling us to. Friends, you can sow in the morning and sow in the evening because the harvest belongs to the God who raised Jesus from the dead. You can release the outcomes that you can't control because they are held by the one who held even death and didn't drop it. You can sustain faithful action in a cynical world because the most faithful action in history happened on a cross and looked like utter failure until Sunday morning. Now hear this. The invitation at the end of this passage isn't try harder to trust God. It's this. Look at what God has done with seeds that already looked lost, and let that be firm ground underneath your feet. Friends, stop watching the wind. Stop watching the wind. Stop standing at the edge of the field building a case for why now isn't quite the right time yet. Stop letting the foolishness around you become the last word within you. This week, get into the field. Get into the field. Sow what you have been given to sow. Morning and evening, with everything that you have, leave the harvest to the one who makes everything.